It's 12 o'clock, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. We have so much to cover. Again, thanks everyone. You have no idea how excited I am about doing this webinar series, as well as seeing the turnout that we have for this really important time of our lives. So again, thank you for joining the first in a series of conversations about voting. My name is Gena Gunn McClendon, and I am the director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, which we lovingly call VAE, at the Center for Social Development in the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. VAE is an initiative whose work is central to the idea that a strong democracy depends on a guarantee that all Americans deserve and have the right to vote. Inclusive voting is the bedrock of democracy. Voting is how Americans decide who represents them. Every citizen who chooses to vote should be able to cast a ballot. Unfortunately, political trends in our voter suppression are alarming. And if things couldn't get worse, we have to add this horrible pandemic, COVID-19, and we have to learn how to navigate democracy through this pandemic. And it's just added more to the seriousness of this particular topic. So VAE uses our expertise to assess and test practical innovations that remove barriers to voting and enhance voter participation, which brings us to why we're here today. This webinar is the first conversation in a series of webinars that address VAE's central theme, will I be able to cast my ballot? Our hope is that this conversation will generate energy around elections in 2020 that, as many have said, is the most important election of our lifetime. Before we move forward, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Michael Sheridan, who directs the Center for Social Development and the Missouri Foundation for Health for their commitment to this important work and providing the financial resources to make the work and this event happen. As a few housekeeping rules or things that we're going to do, participants will remain muted, and we ask that you post your questions in the chat box. The questions in the chat box will be moderated by my partners, Vicki Washington, who leads the St. Louis Area Voting Initiative, and Jennifer Slavic-Lohman, who leads the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition. So today we will hear from 4 wonderful speakers to address today's topic, voter protection and Missouri's new elections law in the age of COVID-19. We have 3 topical areas that we will touch upon today. One is COVID-19 and the expanded voting law, COVID-19 and public health, and voting in the era of COVID-19, that each speaker will have an opportunity to address some of the questions. So to start things off, what I'd like is to have each one of the panelists introduce themselves by sharing their name, organizational affiliation, and current role. And we'll start with Brianna.
All right, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be on this panel today. I think this is a really timely and important discussion that we need to be having. So my name is Brianna Lennon. I'm the county clerk in Boone County, Missouri, which is where Columbia is located. I've been in office since January of 2019, and before that worked for the Missouri Secretary of State's office.
Thank you, Brianna. Dr. Echols?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point. Dr. Echols, I'm the Director of Health for the City of St. Louis, Department of Health, which is located in the City of St. Louis, and we're responsible for spearheading the city's efforts as it relates to the COVID-19 response.
And Eric Fey, let's go next.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Eric Fey. I'm the Democratic Director of Elections at the St. Louis County Board of Elections. I've been election director out here in St. Louis County since January of 2015.
Okay, and last but not least, Denise Lieberman.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Denise Lieberman. I am a voting rights attorney and currently serving as General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. which is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates. I'm also an adjunct professor of political science and law at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm very proud to serve as a faculty director for the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative with the Center for Social Development.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And again, welcome. We appreciate you. So Denise, we'll start with you. So with COVID-19 and the expanded voting law. So Denise, would you give us the current landscape about voting in Missouri and in the country, and then followed by a conversation about the new expanded voting laws, and tell us about the changes and the impact it will have on voters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I do have some slides to share if that's okay.
Yes.
So I want to sort of offer some context here with respect to voting, and also just want us to stay grounded in why we're having this discussion in the way that we are having it. So very often discussions about voting get tied into partisanship and discussions about which candidates you support or don't support. But I would suggest to you that there's something much bigger going on here in the discussion we're having today. And that is that the state of democracy really depends on the ability of all people to be able to have a voice. And that's what voting represents. It's the structural mechanism that we have in society that allows people to have a say in their own destinies, to have self-determination in the issues that affect them. And so that is the context I want to sort of start us off with here today. But of course, we have all kinds of issues and barriers and rules that affect voting. And part of that is because voting is an inherently local process. We have very few national laws that dictate how we vote. And by and large, as you'll hear from the election officials today, voting administration takes place at the local level. There are over 13,000 local election jurisdictions in America, and 116 right here in Missouri, that all have processes for how they carry things out. And all of this has been made more challenging, most certainly because of the COVID-19 crisis. It has upended every aspect of our lives, and certainly, as we'll hear from the election officials today, upended the process of voting as well. So what I want to share with you today is how we're handling this in Missouri. And I think it bears noting how Missouri plays out compared to other states, because other states are not necessarily having to go through, while they're going through similar challenges, particularly addressing the increase in desired mail-in voting. Not every state came into it in the same way we did. In fact, Missouri is among a minority of states in the country that don't already allow any voter to cast an absentee ballot. The vast majority of states allow all voters to cast an absentee ballot without providing a reason. Missouri is not one of them. And so because of that, there are a very limited number of reasons in which you can vote absentee in Missouri. That's one of the reasons that we filed this lawsuit in Missouri. There are several others like it going on around the country. This lawsuit was brought by the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and the ACLU and the ACLU Voting Rights Project on behalf of the NAACP and League of Women Voters, urging the court to acknowledge existing absentee ballot rules that allow people to cast an absentee ballot if they expect to be confined due to illness or disability to apply to people who are practicing social distancing in the age of COVID-19. Now, that case initially got dismissed, went up to the Missouri Supreme Court, which ruled last week that indeed it presents valid, substantial, and real issues. And so this case is now moving forward. In fact, we have a hearing before the judge tomorrow morning. In the meantime, though, the legislature went ahead and passed a law that provides expanded options for mail-in voting just for 2020. And this new law does two primary things. It adds an additional category to the reasons that people can vote absentee in Missouri, adding a reason related to COVID. If you have or you are in an at-risk category for contracting or spreading COVID-19, you can now cast an absentee ballot for that reason without having a notary requirement. The second thing this new law did was provide that all other Missouri voters who might not otherwise qualify to vote absentee can vote by mail in Missouri, but those ballots must be notarized. And there are slightly different rules into how you have to request and cast those ballots. And this is really relevant because absentee voting has already begun for the August elections. It began last week on June 23rd. And these are the 7 reasons now that people are allowed to vote absentee in Missouri. But as you can see, 2 of those reasons, if you expect to be confined due to illness or disability, or are serving as a caretaker for somebody who is, that reason does not require your ballot to be notarized. In addition, reason number 7, if you have or are in an at-risk category for COVID, you can vote absentee without a notary. There are other reasons you can vote absentee in Missouri as well, like being absent from the jurisdiction on election day, or if you're employed as an election authority, for example, working as a poll worker. But if you cast a ballot for those reasons, it will need to be notarized. Right? And so who's in this at-risk category? So again, this is for excuse number 7. If you are in an at-risk category for contracting or spreading COVID-19, you can cast a ballot without a notary requirement. And this will include anybody over the age of 65, anyone in a long-term care facility, anyone with chronic lung disease, including people with moderate to severe asthma, which is a very significant health issue, certainly in our urban centers like St. Louis. Anyone with a serious heart condition, anyone who's immunocompromised, anyone with diabetes, liver disease, or anyone with chronic kidney disease and is on dialysis. All those people will be able to vote absentee without a notary. Right. In addition, people who are permanent absentee voters can cast a ballot without a notary, as can military and overseas voters. And so I want to just very briefly spell out some of the differences in how to get and cast these ballots. The first step is that you have to request a mail-in ballot. So Missouri is not like the 5 states, for example, that do voting mostly by mail, where they mail ballots automatically to registered voters. That does not happen in Missouri and will not happen this year. You have to request a ballot. And you make that request to your local election authority. Okay. Absentee requests can be submitted by mail, fax, email, or in person, but mail ballot requests can only be submitted by mail or in person. I'm going to show you the ballot application right here, or one version of it. This is from the Secretary of State's website. It includes a place to request either an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot. And what you'll see in these areas I've highlighted you have to indicate one. If you're voting absentee, you have to indicate a reason. If you do not indicate a reason, you will not be eligible to cast an absentee ballot. We received a number of calls into the Election Protection Hotline in June from people whose absentee ballot requests were unable to be processed because they did not indicate the reason they were voting absentee. For a mail ballot request, you do not need to state a reason. You simply need to request the ballot. Please note that for a primary election like the upcoming August primary, you will need to indicate the type of ballot you want. You see that's up at the top of this form: Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Constitution, or Green Party ballot, or a nonpartisan ballot. Finally, at the very bottom of this form, it's very important to know your application has to be signed. It must be signed. Finally, you need to know that there are deadlines to submit this request. Your application has to be received by the local election authority by this deadline. So you can't just put it in the mail that day. It has to be received by the local election authority by 5 p.m. on July 22nd for the upcoming August elections. Finally, you should also know that if you are voting absentee, you can also do so in person at your local election authority beginning 6 weeks before Election Day. So again, last Tuesday, June 23rd, was the start of absentee voting for the August primaries. Once you submit that application and it is complete, they will send you a ballot in the mail starting 6 weeks before Election Day. You will then cast your ballot, place that ballot into a secrecy envelope. That's what protects the privacy of your ballot. That then goes into a larger outer envelope that has a form on it that looks a little bit like this application form, where you again will have to attest to your identity, your eligibility to vote, your address, the reason you're voting absentee if you're voting absentee, and whether somebody assisted you in casting that ballot. And if applicable, that ballot envelope will have to be notarized. You must sign that outer ballot envelope or else it will not be processed. And again, if you are voting absentee under the incapacity or confinement due to illness, or because you're at risk for COVID-19, or because you're a permanent or a military overseas voter, that ballot does not have to be notarized, but it does have to be signed. All others, that ballot will have to be notarized, that ballot envelope rather. And finally, there is a deadline for turning your ballot back in, and it has to be received by your local election authority by the close of polls on Election Day. So that means it has to be in the hands of your local election authority by 7 p.m. on August 4th. And so these are some of the differences, though in most cases, the way that your ballot is going to look, and in most cases, the way that you're going to go about requesting and casting your ballot are going to look very much the same, whether it's an absentee or a mail-in ballot. You do need to know that there are slight differences in how you can request that ballot and how to return that ballot. And I will stop there and leave further discussion for the Q&A.
Thanks, Denise. So what you just heard is a lot of information if you haven't heard it before. So I want to ask Brianna and Eric, Denise did a thorough job in talking about that, but is there anything to add? But here's another question I'm really curious about. Because of these recent changes in voting procedures, from your perspective, is this something in the positive direction, a positive step, or has it created more nuances for your office to navigate? And whoever would like to go first, Eric or Brianna?
I want Brianna to go first. I want to see if there are any nuances in her office. I don't know.
I'll go first if you want me to. It's not. I'm also I think I'm the only county clerk that's also an attorney, so that's been lots of fun to deal with. The nuances that we're hearing mostly about, that people have questions about, are really, they're asking why, but they're also asking what is the difference between the absentee ballot and the mail-in ballot. And we've tried to distill it down just to the bare minimum facts of there's no exception for notarizing mail-in ballots. They have to be notarized. If you pick mail-in ballot, it's got to be notarized. You can only apply for it by mail or in person, and you can only return it by mail. So we've had a pretty small number of people that are choosing that application. Up until the point that this law was passed, the biggest question that we kept getting was, is there a COVID-19 specific excuse for absentee voting? And now there is. Whether it says at risk or whether it says the nuances of what's involved in it, what I am finding is that what most people are looking at when they're filling it out is the words COVID-19. And if they find the words COVID-19, that's what they pick. We actually had a large number of people picking the safe at home category, which is the confidentiality address program that the Secretary of State's office runs, that very clearly in the application says you can only apply if you're part of this program in this specific set of statutes that is designed for domestic abuse survivors. But the last part of the sentence on the application says for being safe at home. And so we had a large number of people apply and then call and say, I wanted to be safe at home during COVID. That's the excuse that I wanted. And we had to do a lot of voter education on that. So yes, there are a lot of nuances in practice. They get blurred a little bit because what people are really looking for is that COVID-19 excuse. And so we've tried to put education out about that. But the biggest distinction people want to know is, I keep hearing mail-in ballot and I keep hearing absentee. And in general election administration terms, there really is no difference between the two. But now legally under this new law, there is. And so people have to know that the difference is really the way that you apply and the fact that it must be notarized.
I'd certainly agree with all those comments that Brianna just made. We're having, and we have had similar experiences in our office here in St. Louis County. The one thing I might add is just a little bit of background as to how we got here. And for those of you who don't know, there's a statewide County Clerks and Election Authorities Association that I think all the counties are members of. And for a few years now, we have been pushing the legislature for no excuse absentee voting in Missouri, because from an administrative point of view, that would just be easiest to allow anybody who wants to vote by absentee ballot to do so. But so that being said, this new law that has been passed and has been put in place just for 2020, although in some aspects I think it is confusing and we're certainly getting a lot of questions about it, I think it does make the process easier ultimately for voters and election administrators. Because, for instance, you know, if somebody checks the address confidentiality program and they're not a member of it, now with this law in our office, you know, we're just going to send them a mail ballot, you know, if they check that, rather than try to reject their application and send them a letter and say, hey, you're not part of this program, send it back. So I think it makes it a little bit easier for the voter. But of course, it would have been just easiest to eliminate the excuses altogether, in my opinion.
Okay, great. So while we've had a great conversation about the expanded voting law, I want to turn to in-person voting and talk a little bit about COVID-19 and public health. And so, Dr. Echols, you're up here. So we've got these surges in the infection rate of COVID-19. I mean, things are spiking. Not that you have a crystal ball, but can you offer information about St. Louis City and the region in terms of what we might reasonably anticipate the rates being for August and November?
All right, so that's a really great point. So COVID-19 has really changed how we do a lot of business operations, and voting isn't excluded from that. So as we all know, voting polls or voting sites can be places where social mixing occurs. So you have different individuals from different homes coming to one common area to perform a task. And sometimes that in this particular setting, you know, they're talking with one another. At least in the past, they've been talking with one another, having conversations while they wait for their time to vote. And as we all know, with COVID-19, as it is transmitted by via respiratory transmission, meaning that infected aerosolized droplets are spread from an infected person and inhaled or by another person, leads to the transmission or the spread of COVID-19. And that can easily occur in a setting like a voting site where you have multiple people coming from different households congregating in one particular area. And so the longer they congregate in those areas, the higher the likelihood for COVID-19 transmission, as well as the spread of other illnesses that can be spread by COVID-19. So there are specific measures that need to be implemented to prevent the spread of COVID-19 at the voting sites. So things such as making sure you have line monitors to make sure people are properly physically distancing themselves from particularly other individuals from other households is going to be important. Making sure there are proper hand sanitizing stations available. And that's important, but it's also important to know that if individuals are using hand sanitizer, before they use the paper or electronic voting apparatus that can actually, if their hands aren't completely dry, that can actually damage the electronic machines or the paper that's being used. So it's important for individuals to know that their hands need to be completely dry before actually voting. In addition to that, making sure that measures are in place so that individuals have face coverings while they're in that space, again, to prevent individuals from spreading infected aerosolized droplets while they're in that space is also going to be important. So making sure that we outline all of the infection control measures. They really need to be standardized across jurisdictions so individuals will know exactly what to expect. In the city of St. Louis, we work really closely with our voting authority, the local voting authorities, to make sure that we have the proper resources in place, not only for those who are coming to vote, but also that we have those resources in place for the staff who are volunteering their time to assist with the voting process. So it's important for those individuals to practice sound infection controls measures, as well as those individuals that are visiting or passing through to cast their ballots.
Okay, great. So has St. Louis City offered additional resources to the Board of Elections to make sure that those protocols and that hand sanitizers and all those sort of things will be available in the poll places?
Absolutely. So during the previous election, the city of St. Louis provided face coverings as well as hand sanitizer and other resources that are needed to implement the infection control measures.
Okay.
And we'll continue to do so. I think the other piece for that is also making sure that the community at large has access to those resources. So making sure face masks or face coverings are available at the voting sites is going to be important, in addition to the hand sanitizer. But even before that, so I think public health has another role in this as well. So making sure that our most vulnerable populations receive information about voting and some of the restrictions or requirements that are necessary is going to be really important. Oftentimes, what we'll see is that we will cater to the general population, which is those individuals who may have access to TV, social media, internet, but we have some really vulnerable populations in the city and other jurisdictions that don't have access to internet, TV, and social media. And so making sure we have a grassroots campaign that are grassroots organizations that can go out into the community to make sure our most vulnerable individuals have the information they need. I'm sure the information that Denise Lieberman previously shared, a lot of that information may be new to a lot of individuals, even on this call. And so making sure we're doing our due diligence to make sure our most vulnerable has the information they need so they can properly cast their vote in a timely manner will be important.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. There are a lot of people on this call that are big advocates for voting, and they're looking for something to do. They're looking for a role, a safe role that they can do. And so being able to spread this information is one thing that I think is all of our responsibility. So let's see, I think you sort of answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask. If there's one particular, let's say a meme or just a quick thing that you would tell people. So you have a lot of people that refuse and don't want to vote absentee for one reason or another. And I'm going to ask Eric and Brianna to address that later. But what's the elevator speech for the person who goes to vote in person, whether they're a poll worker or whether they're voting in person? So it's wear a mask, safe distancing, anything else? Would you add to that?
If you're one of those individuals who have an increased risk for contracting COVID-19 or experiencing severe complications from COVID-19, it's really important that you use the absentee option. That helps reduce your risk or reduce the potential for becoming exposed to COVID-19 and potentially getting infected.
Okay.
Gena, may I add something to that really quick? Because I think that's a very, very good point that you've raised. And there are while mail-in voting is absolutely critical for this election, there are many people for whom it's not a great option, including some voters with disabilities who need particularized assistance, people who are housing insecure, people who, for whatever reason, don't really have reliable mail access. And I think it's important to remember that people can also, if you want to avoid the polling place on election day, that you can also vote absentee in person. And now you would have to leave your home to do that, but you wouldn't be going to a crowded polling place. You would be going to the office of your local election authority. And you can do that starting now, it started June 23rd, up until 5 p.m. the day before election day. And so you can show up in person and vote absentee in person at your local election authority until 5 p.m. on Monday, August 3rd.
Eric and Brianna, do you have anything else to add? Is there anything in particular that you are planning to do for the protection of your poll workers and voters for in-person or in-person?
Sure. Just one thing to piggyback on Denise's comment there about in-person absentee voting. And I agree that's absolutely a critical part of this whole process. In St. Louis County, starting 2 Thursdays before the election, we stand up 4 additional satellite absentee voting centers, and that's for in-person absentee voting. So they will be spread across St. Louis County. And not only can voters go there to vote absentee in person, but they could drop off their absentee ballot and have it accepted there. So I just wanted to mention that before we talk, before I answer your question about in-person voting. And we are trying to do a lot of pretty much everything that Dr. Echols mentioned to enforce social distancing in the polling places with markers on the floor, training with our poll workers. All of our poll workers have masks and or face shields that we provide for them. There's hand sanitizer for the voters. We are working with St. Louis County's health department currently to procure enough masks to offer to all the voters that come to the polling place. We saw in June that most voters, the vast majority, came with their own masks, but we want to have enough to offer to voters if they don't have one. And then we also have a number of cleaning products in each polling place that the poll workers will use and have used to sanitize the voting equipment, meaning the pens, the stylus that the voter uses to sign the electronic poll book. We're trying to do those things to make the process as safe as possible. But I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that, just like Dr. Echols mentioned, the best bet, if it's an option for you, is to vote by absentee ballot. We highly encourage that. And I just can't emphasize that enough. So I'll stop there and let Brianna talk.
Yeah, I think by and large, as Eric said, we have an association of county clerks, and this is a discussion that comes up quite a bit, is what everyone's doing on election day to protect their election judges and voters. What we did for the June election, which worked really well, was we have plexiglass kind of barriers that every election judge sits behind so that they have some physical distancing between each voter. They also had masks and face shields that they could wear, as well as all of the hand sanitizer and the cleaning. We have we participate in the youth participant program, which brings high school students into our polling places. And so they were very helpful with keeping places cleaned and sanitized. Although we're also very mindful of the fact that this was a much lower turnout election than what we will see in August and November. So we're working now on trying to scale up all of those precautions and make sure that our polling places themselves are available and able to have that many people standing in socially distant lines. So, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it is a challenge right now to make sure that that is all happening. And we're a substantially smaller county than St. Louis County, but we still have very high turnout in presidential elections. We had, for a few polling places that would normally have been polling places that we had to pull out of because they were assisted living facilities, we went in advance, me and another member of my staff, and did in-person absentee voting for them. so that they could take advantage of absentee voting. And that really helped relieve some of the pressure, as well as promoting absentee voting, pretty much as Eric and Director Echols already said. It's the safest option if it is available to you. Coming into our office, we're also socially distanced, and we have plexiglass barriers between our staff and voters as well, and we wear masks. So coming in person absentee, we very rarely have any lines because it spreads throughout the whole day and for the whole 6-week period. So we're open this coming Saturday on July 4th because it's the Saturday before the voter registration deadline. So we stay open and people often come in and absentee vote then. Satellite locations have been something that I've been wanting to do, but we have not gotten to that point yet.
Okay. So speaking of poll locations, have you mentioned that you had to make a few changes, Brianna and Eric. What's the situation? I mean, we watched Wisconsin, we saw Georgia, all these polling places closing. It was just a disaster. What are we facing in St. Louis County in terms of poll closing and things like that?
Yeah, I can really only comment on what we're doing in St. Louis County. I don't know, what some of my colleagues in the city are planning at this point, but in St. Louis County for June, we drastically reduced the amount of polling places we had by over half. Now it worked out pretty well in June because we had such low turnout and because over 40% of our voters voted by absentee ballot. And that may not sound significant, but all the folks watching this should know that we have never had more than 10% of the voters in any election vote by absentee ballot. We had more people vote by absentee ballot in the June election than we did in the last presidential election. So as we move forward, we have about 50 more polling places in August than we did in June. And so we're hoping that we can have a significant portion of the voters vote by absentee ballot. I'm hoping personally for 50% absentee turnout. That way it'll really cut down on the amount of people who will be going to a polling place. And then in November, we hope to scale it up a little bit more in the amount of polling places. I don't think that we'll be at a place where we'll have as many polling places as we did, say, in the last presidential election. But again, if we have this many people voting by absentee ballot, we should be able to accommodate it. Now, I'm not going to say we're not going to have lines. I mean, any presidential election, there will be lines. We just have to try to keep them manageable. I would also add that, what happened in Wisconsin and in Georgia was very problematic. There were a lot of other things going on in those states at the time that led to that happening. I mean, they had a drastic reduction in polling places, much more so than we have had. But I will say Kentucky, which had an election, it was this week or last week. I mean, they went to one polling place per county, but what they did, they mailed the absentee ballot applications to every voter. They had a significant early voting period where people could come vote prior to election day. So lines, even in the larger counties of Kentucky, where they only had one large polling place, lines were relatively manageable. So I think the lesson that we take away from all those other experiences is to try to encourage people to vote by absentee ballot. A lot of those states that had problems were doing large amounts of mail voting, kind of for the first time. And it'll be the same for us, but, we've practiced in June. We'll have another bite at the apple here in August. So hopefully by the time we get to November, we're clicking on all cylinders in terms of getting absentee ballot requests and sending them out. But yes, it's just in the environment we have, it would just, I think, be very difficult to impossible to have our full complement of polling places because we have to train all these poll workers and bring them into our office for training and have very hands-on training, be in close quarters, and that's just not advisable in this environment. So we're trying to have as many polling places as possible while also promoting absentee voting so as not to have too much overcrowding on election day.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Wow, that's a whole flood of other questions came into my head after you talked about the close quarters and training, and I've seen that because of the tour that you gave us last year. Speaking of the training, I guess it's impossible for you to do a training virtually when you're talking about, teaching people how to use machines and things like that.
Well, what we started in June, and that's a great question. We trained the majority of our poll workers virtually, but these were all folks who had done it before. We brought just a few people in classes of no more than 10 people at a time so we could maintain social distancing. And we did some in-person training because virtual training is not possible for all of our poll workers for a variety of reasons. But many of our workers for August and November will be trained online. It'll be retraining. Again, we're not training anybody virtually who's a first timer. So for June and for August, we aren't using any first timers because really first timers, they need to come in, they need to put their hands on the equipment. It needs to be very intensive and hands-on. For November, we don't know yet if we'll be using first-time poll workers. We're just going to have to see how many people are willing to work again. But yes, training, we've even had a number of people say, I'd really love to be a poll worker. And it's really hard because normally we can't get enough. And now we have some people saying they want to do it. And it's really hard to say, just wait, cool your jets, because the training, that's the part that's holding us up.
Okay. So we just have a few more minutes before we go into answering some of the questions in the chat. But I do want to, we've heard, Denise and Dr. Echols and Brianna and Eric both keep talking about the value of voting absentee or doing mail-in voting, which brings me back to the requirement of a notary. So I just applied and became a notary. I have no idea what this can look like, but I do have, and I did it because I wanted to be helpful with this election and be available for people. So my question is, one, where do you find notaries? But then the other issue too is the public health risk. I'm willing to do it, but how can I be safe, and how can other notaries be safe? And how do you find notaries? And I'll let whoever wants to jump in to respond. Denise or Dr. Echols?
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little, go ahead, Denise.
Oh, no, you can go ahead.
So as far as being safe, so a lot of the guidelines that we've established for businesses, require that they implement, social distancing measures, as well as other protective measures such as wearing face coverings when they're providing services to the general public. And so that the notaries aren't excluded from that. And so our expectation is that they would adhere to those guidelines as well. I think it's also one thing to be mindful of is, as Eric mentioned, having to reduce the number of sites. That can also that can be some unintended consequences associated with that, similar to what we had with when we're implementing mitigation strategies for COVID-19 to slow the spread. There was some unintended consequences that occurred from that. And so, for example, for closing or reducing the number of voting sites, if it's not done in a racial and health equity through racial and health equity lens, you can create additional barriers for those most vulnerable individuals in your jurisdiction. And so that would limit their ability, or even in some cases prevent them from being able to cast that ballot. And that in itself will be an injustice. So our hope is that, the local voting authorities will really decide which sites to close by using the racial and health equity lens.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that forward. Denise, did you?
Yeah, I wanted to add just a couple points about the notaries. Now, keep in mind again that there are several types of absentee ballots that do not require a notary, right? So if you are casting an absentee ballot under what I'm calling excuse number 2, because you expect to be confined due to illness or disability, or if you're casting an absentee ballot because you are in an at-risk category for COVID-19, and that was that whole list we discussed earlier, those ballots do not need to be notarized. Neither do ballots if you are on the permanent absentee voter list. which is not that difficult to get on. You can apply to get on. Otherwise, your ballot, whether it's an absentee or a mail-in ballot, will have to be notarized, at least for now. And I will say that we do have a claim in our lawsuit that's pending right now, arguing that that due to COVID, that people should not be required to have their ballots notarized. So we are arguing both that anybody who's practicing social distancing can reasonably say that they expect to be confined due to illness, which does not require a notary. But we're also arguing that making any voter choose between exercising their right to vote and their safety by either requiring them to go to a polling place or requiring them to get a ballot notarized would violate their right to vote. And so that is pending. So some of the rules could change depending on what happens with this court case. But it's also important to keep in mind that as the rules currently exist, you cannot get absentee ballots notarized electronically or remotely. Governor Parson did issue an emergency order authorizing a remote notarization for certain kinds of documents. And the legislature passed a bill as well, authorizing remote notarization, although that bill has not been signed into law yet. The problem is that the law requires for absentee ballots that notary seal appear on the actual envelope that contains your ballot. And so that's what makes it a little bit different from, say, like a will, if I'm trying to get my will notarized, because I can PDF that and I can email it to a person who's sitting on a video conference call like we're on right now, and they can get it printed out, put their notary seal on it, scan it, send it right back to you over email. That process doesn't work with the absentee ballots. So many groups in Missouri are working to organize notarization events. Many people, like Professor McClendon, are signing up to become notaries. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition has created a notary hub that's sort of a collaboration for both people who are notaries or want to become notaries, where we will hook them up with groups and organizations that are both helping walk people through the notarization process and organizing notary events in their communities. And so anybody that signs up on that hub will then get access to all those resources, and they will also be put up on a website.
Okay, excellent. And notaries are not, by law, can't charge for this.
Well, so under Missouri law makes it illegal for a notary to charge to notarize an absentee ballot. That express language is not included in the mail ballot statute.
Right.
And remote notarization, they can always charge for remote notarization. But again, that's not going to be available for absentee ballots.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. So we have about 12 minutes to address some of the questions in the chat. And I think some of the questions, Denise and Brianna, and maybe Eric, I'm not sure, were responding to those absentee questions, but I'm gonna turn it over to Vicki Washington and to Jennifer Slavic-Loman, who have been communicating back and forth to make sure that some of the questions in the chat can get answered. So I will turn it over to them.
Okay, thank you, Gena. We have a pretty good list of questions. This is Vicki. And one question, Eric, is for you. How will people who are 65 or older, when will they, who submitted all of their absentee ballot requests at one time, when are their actual ballots going to be mailed to them for this election?
They're going out as we speak. We're sending them out in large waves, 3,000 to 5,000 at a time. So, you know, it's a very large backlog to work through, but they're all going to be out in the days to come. And one thing I just want to add about notaries, at least in St. Louis County, any voter who wants to bring their ballot, drop it off at our office or one of our satellite offices, we can notarize it as well.
Good to know. Thank you.
Hi, this question is for basically anyone. What is now the difference in treatment between excuse number 2 and excuse number 7? We've had a lot of questions about that because when people think of being at risk for COVID and they realize that excuse number 7 has a very specific set of health conditions and age in it, is excuse number 2 still something that people can use for concerns about COVID?
I can start and just with what the language says, and then the election officials can talk about how they're interpreting and processing it. Because again, it's your local election authority that receives and processes these requests. There's a couple of differences. First, excuse number 2 is permanent and it exists all the time. And it states that if you expect to be incapacitated or confined due to illness or physical disability, or you are serving as a primary caretaker for somebody who is, you can vote absentee without a notary. So that is non-specific as to the illness, but the primary point of excuse number 2 is that you expect to be incapacitated or confined. The other big difference is that it does allow that provision for someone who's serving as a caretaker for somebody who's incapacitated or confined due to illness or disability. Number 7 is specific to people who are in an at-risk category for COVID. And the statute is very specific as to what constitutes being at risk. And you're absolutely right, or the questioner is correct, that it doesn't necessarily include all of the range of conditions that might make somebody at risk. So it only includes that list that I read off earlier. So it does not include perhaps other conditions that might make one at risk, like maybe being very obese, for example. You would have to fall into one of those other categories. But I will note that to submit a request for an absentee ballot, you don't need to include with that request a doctor's note or copy of your medical history. You do need to check one of the boxes though.
Okay, thank you. The next question would be for both election officials. Do you send voters notification that their absentee ballots have been counted?
I just wanted to piggyback one thing just to wrap up what Denise was talking about. In terms of our processing of the excuses, we accept the excuses. What we're looking at are voter qualifications. We're making sure that you're a registered voter. We're making sure that you're eligible to get an absentee ballot, but we can't check in on you to see whether you picked the right excuse. So aside from the address confidentiality one that I mentioned earlier, because that literally is marked in your voter record as being part of the address confidentiality program, whether you pick excuse 2 or excuse 7 has no bearing on our processing of it. We process it the exact same way we would any other absentee ballot. The question that you just asked about providing updates, our office does have, we've added in a email system. So if you apply, we have an online absentee application for Boone County voters that they can go on and apply. And if you provide your email address, when you do that, we can send an email out when we have sent the ballot to you and when we have received the ballot. I will have to check on whether we also send it after the fact once it's been counted, but I know that we do let people know when it's being sent out to them so that they can start looking for it in the mail, and when we have received it in our office so that they know that we have it in hand.
Thank you. Eric?
Similar in St. Louis County, we don't send emails, but with each absentee ballot is included a tracking number for the voter. It's printed on a detachable stub that's attached to the ballot. So if a voter uses that tracking number, we will update them if they log on. They put that number, and we will update them when we receive the ballot back here.
So the question was about, do you notify them that their ballot has been counted?
Well, we confirm when we receive it.
Okay.
So I would say in almost every case, that means it's going to be counted. So let me put it this way. If there's a deficiency with the absentee ballot or now the mail-in ballot, for instance, let's say the voter doesn't sign it at all, or they don't have it notarized when it's supposed to be notarized. In St. Louis County, if time still permits, we just send that back to the voter in the mail and say, look, you forgot to sign it, please sign it, send it back to us. So we don't count that as received yet, technically. So,
Okay.
but once it's received, then, you know, the process starts of opening it and counting it. But if there's a deficiency, if time permits, if it's not, you know, the day before the election, we will send it back to the voter for correction.
Okay, thank you.
And part of the reason for that is we don't know that they're counted until basically after election day, because they're counted all the way through. We can start processing them 5 days before the election. We're processing them, which means we're taking the ballots out of the envelopes and we're making sure that, you know, they're all set aside and where they're supposed to be, but they're not checked into our system and, you know, giving voter credit to each individual voter until after the election.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a related question to that, and that is, when you do receive an absentee ballot, are you checking to see whether the ballot is fully correct on the outside, whether it's valid immediately upon receipt? And you said, Eric, that you sent them back when time permits, but let's say time doesn't permit. Do you ever call the voters and tell them that their ballot was deficient in some way and was going to be rejected, and give them the option to vote in person, either absentee or at the polling place?
So we stop sending ballots back to voters once, you know, we know that the mail is not gonna make it back and forth. And at that point, unfortunately, you know, our staff is so busy that we just don't have the time to call people or email them and say, you know, you forgot to have it notarized, you need to come in and do that. And that is, in my opinion, one of the shortcomings of Missouri law. And I don't want to get too far afield here, but there is no cure period in Missouri law for absentee ballots, and that would be nice. So if we receive a ballot the day before the election or on election day and a voter hasn't signed it or it's not notarized, there should be a period of time where the election authority could contact the voter and the voter could come in and cure that deficiency. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. And unfortunately, we just don't have the staff to call everybody and say, hey, you didn't do this, you know, come to the office or get it signed, or, you know, go to the polling place.
What percentage of absentee ballots are rejected for deficiencies?
In St. Louis County, and as you know, Jennifer, because I sent this to you, it runs pretty consistently at around 4 to 5%. The majority of the rejections are for folks turning them in too late. The second highest reason is for lack of a notary, when a notary is required. But I think that's an excellent point. If I could just very quickly talk about that point, that most are rejected because they're received too late. They're received after election day. These mail-in ballots that Denise was explaining earlier, they can only be sent back to us by mail. If you bring back to us, to Brianna or I, a mail-in ballot, we cannot accept it. If you bring it back in person, you have to put it through the U.S. mail. That's the way they wrote the law, unfortunately. So I want to emphasize to people, do not delay in returning your absentee ballot. For everybody listening, please emphasize to people, get that back in the mail. The delivery standards for the USPS are 3 to 10 days. And so if you're in town, at least in the St. Louis area, that 3 days is pretty accurate. But if you, for instance, are mailing your absentee ballot from Mizzou in Columbia back to St. Louis County, it's going to be closer to 7 days probably. So that is a really important point for voters to know.
Thank you. Brianna, how do you handle that situation in Boone County?
Which part?
The ballot rejection of absentee ballots for deficiencies, and how you follow up with voters or not, and what percentage of ballots in your jurisdiction are rejected for deficiencies?
So in terms of when they come in, we do look at them as they come in. Up to this point, so we have about 115,000 voters total in Boone County, and we've got 2 absentee people that process all of these as they're coming in. So as they're coming in, they are looking at them because they're checking them into the system so that they're marked as received. If there is a problem with them, then we do call or email. And very similar to what Eric said, once the mailing situation and timing does not work anymore, then we just can't do that. We do still occasionally call people to have them come directly to the office if we know that they're in town. So if there's a problem with their ballot, then we can do that. And because we've got 5 days to start processing, we did for this last election have 2 or 3 where the bipartisan team that was processing the ballots found that there were deficiencies, and we were able to contact the voters and they came to the office and fixed the problem. But it's not a guaranteed thing because, as Eric said, we have absentees are not the only thing that's happening in election prep at that time. So 5 days out, we've got people pulled in a lot of different directions. So the other thing that I think is the same as what Eric deals with are the reasons for why the ballots are being rejected. So our rejection rate is pretty much the same. We really only have a handful. By the time the ballots come back to us, as long as they're in our hands, there's a very small number of them that ever get rejected for anything else, except for Notary. Sometimes there's Notary. But because I'm newer to this county, I oversaw everything that was happening for absentee voting for the June election because we also exceeded our records for the number of absentee voters that we had. So I wanted to make sure that they were all processed properly. There were only a handful, like literally 5 or 6 that were not counted out of the 3,600 that we received back. But we did receive a lot of them late. And so we can't do anything about that when we're getting them on Wednesday and Thursday. So we've been working with, because we're smaller and the post office, the main post office is just 2 blocks away from me. I've been working with our post office to streamline the way that we get the ballots delivered to us so that anything that is in circulation, if they can get their hands on it on Tuesday by 7 p.m., they will put it in my office.
Thank you.
Question is for both of the election officials, and Denise, feel free to chime in if you can add anything to their responses. So the question is, what happens if a person requests and receives an absentee/mail-in ballot, but then decides they'd rather vote in person on election day?
So at least in St. Louis County, that happened quite a bit in the June election. And if a voter actually has the ballot, they can take it to their polling place, surrender it. It'll be spoiled by the election judges and they'll vote a new ballot in the polling place. If they have lost the ballot or if the dog ate it, something like that, they can still go to the polling place. The election judges will call our office to confirm that we haven't received the ballot, and then they'll allow the voter to vote a new ballot at the polling place. So it's still possible. I will say, like I mentioned, there's a little extra paperwork there for the voter. So it's not optimal, but it is possible. And a lot of people did use that option in June.
Ours is exactly the same as St. Louis County.
Okay, everyone, it's 1:03. We've reached the end of our great workshop. I'd like to give a round of applause to everyone who participated in this event, my partners, our panelists, and then of course the people behind the scenes, Ara, Tanika, John, and Taylor. Thank you for your help in keeping us organized during today's event. So there are a couple of takeaways. One is, that everyone do as much as they can to vote absentee or mail in. That seems to be the best way to protect yourself from COVID. And if that's not possible or doable, when you go to vote in person, make sure that you're protected. And there are certain protocols that the Board of Elections, along with the assistance from public health, from the Department of Public Health, Those are good too. And then it was something that still resonates with me with what Dr. Echols said, and that is this the notion of which polling places based on demographics, if you will, to be considered. And so Brianna and Eric, as you're thinking about which ones to close, I'm wondering if there's a way that you could look at where your absentee is coming from based on a GIS mapping, and maybe help determine where you may do your closures. You know, that's one way to think about it. And I think it would be sort of a fair and equitable way, not to tell you what to do, but you know what I mean. But anyway, this has been fantastic. Denise is doing something similar tomorrow, or is it today, Denise?
The Missouri Foundation for Health one is tomorrow.
Oh yes, the Missouri Foundation for Health tomorrow. Thanks again to them for helping us with this event. And there are a couple of other things. We have your email addresses. We'll keep you informed with everything as best we can. And we appreciate you. Thanks again for participating.